Hello again. I'm Jason, and I'm here to talk about some more books. I wanted to talk real quickly about something in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. There's one thing that it spoiled my enjoyment of the book. There was this whole thing, as I said before, about if you weren't trained in Japan to kill zombies, you didn't get the best training. And so Elizabeth, who was trained in China, she was looked down upon by some of the others because their training happened to be from Japan, and hers was from China, so hers wasn't as good. But Elizabeth had a sword. She had a katana that she used to kill zombies. And my nitpicky little brain took one look at that and said, she was trained in China. And what's she doing with a Japanese sword? She wouldn't have been trained with a katana. She would have been trained with the Chinese Dao, or something like the Green Destiny from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. She would have been trained with a Chinese weapon, because that's where she trained it. And a katana is a Japanese sword. The katana, if the author wants to use a katana, I have no problem with it. But that weapon would have been more appropriate for Lady Catherine or Mr. Darcy, both of whom trained in Japan. Anyway, like I said, this is my nitpicky brain going into overdrive. What I want to get into is The Hobbit, and I know a lot of people are burned out on that, and that's kind of why I want to talk about it. So, The Hobbit has been one of my favorite books since I could read it. Basically, what happened was I was introduced to the Hobbit actually through the Rankin Bass cartoon, which I believe came out in 1978. I'd have to check on the date on that one, but it came out a long time ago. Anyway, in comparison to the Rankin Bass cartoon and the Peter Jackson 3-movie epic trilogy, in my opinion, the Rankin Bass version is a better version of The Hobbit than Peter Jackson's version. And I know people might get outraged about that, but to me, don't get me wrong, the Peter Jackson's movies are great from an action movie standpoint. From the standpoint of, did he make a good version of The Hobbit? No, he didn't. He just didn't. He messed up in so many ways. And that's kind of why I want to talk about it. Because I think a lot of people have this misconception of, especially if they've never read the book, that that book is going to be like what Peter Jackson portrayed on the screen. And why am I getting into this? Well, Thanksgiving just was last week. And Thanksgiving Day, we were sitting around at my in-laws. We had just enjoyed the dinner. They flipped on the TV. There were no sports games on at the time, so they're flipping through the channels, and it came to one that was playing the first Hobbit movie. So my kids, my kids wanted to watch it, and I'm not against other people getting enjoyment out of the movie. I'm not, and so if I was completely against the movie, I wouldn't have let them watch it. So, I let them watch it and everything. The thing is that I've actually read The Hobbit to my kids, and they enjoyed the movie, and we even own the entire trilogy. I own all 6, well, 3 of them belong to my daughter, and 3 of them belong to me. So the Lord of the Rings movies belong to me, the Hobbit movies belong to my daughter. Basically, I decided I'm not going to buy those movies for myself because because I have mixed feelings about them. It's not a good Hobbit movie, but it's a good movie. But I have to divorce in my mind that it's based on The Hobbit. Otherwise, I start getting, nitpicky about it. Anyway, moving on. So, the movie does have some similarities, obviously. They based it on the book. Let me go to the book. So the book was written a long time ago. What happened was, like I said, I got interested in the book from the cartoon. I don't remember if I knew at the time when I'd first seen the cartoon that it was based on a book. I didn't know that. My dad said, well, if you like the cartoon, here's the book. Handed it to me. And I was in 3rd grade at the time, and I started reading it, and I got to Riddles in the Dark, and just couldn't get past that. I don't know if it was... I suspect it was my reading level at the time, but then I picked it up again in 4th grade, and the same thing happened. I read up to Riddles in the Dark and just couldn't get past Riddles in the Dark. It was possibly too difficult at the time. 5th grade came around, my teacher decided to read it to us as a class, and I picked it up and breezed through it, no problems. So, at that point in time, my reading level must have gone up enough so that when I read through it, it was a great book. I loved it. And I've read it, I can't tell you how many times. I used to read it about once a year. That's how much I liked it. Now I have too many other books that I'm trying to read, not because it's just I have a lot of books on my bookshelf I haven't read yet. I want to get to them, and so I don't want to read a book I've already read when I have all these other books that I still haven't read yet. Anyway, so The Hobbit opens with Bilbo checking his mail, going outside, and he bumps into Gandalf. Gandalf then has the dialogue with Bilbo and says he's going to send him on this adventure, which then makes Bilbo panic, and he runs back into his hole. But he invites Gandalf to tea. The whole inviting Gandalf to tea never happened in the movie. Not that it necessarily needed to, but then the dwarves show up, basically one by one. A few of them show up in pairs, but the thing is like, first one dwarf comes, and Bilbo's like, oh shoot, I forgot to write down that I was expecting Gandalf for tea. And so he goes running to the door and finds this dwarf there, who invites himself in, and then one by one the other dwarves show up. It's not this whole we pull open the door and 15 dwarves fall, or not 15 because that's too many, but half the dwarves fall on top of each other. Although the last, I believe it's 4 dwarves and Gandalf, once again I'd have to check the details, but basically Bilbo jerks open the door, the dwarves fall in with Bombur on top and Thorin on the bottom. Thorin doesn't have some secret mission that makes him late to this meeting. He's just one of the last to arrive. Also, in the company of Gandalf. Gandalf doesn't, show up by himself or something. Anyway, they do the whole business thing, and Bilbo thinks he's lucky the next day when they leave. And he wakes up and everything's, messy. The food's still out, and his hole is not cleaned, because the dwarves, in getting ready to leave, they had breakfast and everything, and then they book it because they don't have time to stand around and clean. And this is one of the first things that really just irks me about this movie. Bilbo didn't run out of his door happy and shouting and going like, I'm going on an adventure. Yes, this is going to be great. No. Gandalf shows up and says, you've got 30 minutes to be miles away from here. Get going. And basically kicks Bilbo out of his house without, any word of what's going on. It's just like, you got to get out of here. Go, run, go. And Bilbo may have never even gone on this adventure if Gandalf hadn't shown up at that point. So he meets up with the dwarves, and they go on, and they do have some of these things are just weird the way that they decided to do them. They have the adventure with the trolls, but it happens slightly different. They had a rainy night, and so they couldn't get the fire started, and then they saw the glow from the fire, and they go to investigate. All 14 of them. Gandalf wasn't there, But all 14 of them go investigate, rather than, like, for some reason the troll finds these ponies with, tack and reins and stuff, and doesn't even bother to find out where they came from. I mean, come on. The trolls are dumb. They're not that dumb. They would have said, like, well, where did these ponies come from? If these ponies, because they would have rather eaten men. That was their thing. They would have rather eaten a sentient being than a pony. One of the things that they were arguing about was that they only had mutton to eat, and they would have much rather eaten man flesh, because apparently it's tastier. And so when the dwarves show up, well, they send Bilbo in, and Bilbo tries to pick one of the troll's pockets and ends up pulling out an enchanted purse that starts shouting at him. And the trolls capture him that way. And then he tries to warn the dwarves to run away, and that's when all the dwarves get caught by the trolls. The thing is that at that point, they had forgotten about Bilbo. They tossed him into a bush. He was just really tiny, and the dwarves were much bigger than him and better to eat. And so then it's Gandalf who saves all their butts. Because he keeps the trolls arguing all night about the best way to prepare the dwarves. It's not Bilbo who stands up and goes like, maybe we should do this. No. The trolls were going to either roast the dwarves, chop them up and boil them, if I remember correctly, or squash them into jelly and save them for later. And so when they fought and kicked and poked at each other until finally they decided to do one thing. And then a voice came out that sounded like one of the trolls' voices and said, we'd have to get more firewood if we're going to roast them, and it'll take all night. And he's like, well, firewood, then you can go get... And then they start arguing again. And they argue and argue and argue until they decide that what they're going to do is chop them up and boil them. And then they're like, we have to go get the water. And this voice comes and says this and sounds like one of the other trolls. And they're like, so it starts up the fight again. And then they just settle on squashing them all into jelly and saving them for later. And that's when Gandalf comes up and says, Dawn take you all and be stoned to you. And immediately the trolls are turned to stone. So they loot the trolls, of course. Bilbo picks up his little sword. Gandalf and Thorin both find really nice elven blades that they take with them, and they go off to Rivendell. Now, in the movie, they would have you believe that Radagast the Brown shows up for some reason and leads the orcs on a chase, and that there's orcs that are tracking Thorin and company. Yeah, that's stupid. It never should have been in there. There were no orcs, no Radagast the Brown. Radagast the Brown is a character from The Lord of the Rings, not from The Hobbit. He had no part in The Lord of the Rings, or had no part in The Hobbit at all. Anyway, they just go to Rivendell. Now, they do kind of get lost. Gandalf is trying to find Rivendell. Rivendell's kind of hidden, so it's not always easy to find. He finally does bring them to Rivendell, but it's not like they're having this cat and mouse game where they're hiding from the orcs that are trying to capture them or anything like that. It's just they go to Rivendell. It's not really that big a deal. They get to Rivendell, and Elrond isn't a giant jerk. He isn't like, oh, well, you're going back to your ancient homeland? I can't allow that. What business is it of Elrond's? Elrond actually helps them. He outfits them with more food, gives them what help he can, gives them directions to get through the mountains, warns them that there might be problems with goblins in the passes. and advises them, don't take this path, take this one instead, that one's safer. It turns out it's not, but it turns out that the goblins moved their front door. So, they weren't getting enough loot and pillage the other way, so they moved it to another part of the mountain because people were going around it. But the thing is that there's not this... My friend, we went and saw the movie together, and when we got done with it, we're like, holy cow, what did they put that in for? They had the whole thing with the White Council and Galadriel showing up and Saruman and Elrond and all that stuff. And they have them show up for whatever reason, and they're like, he equated it to being a UN for Middle-earth. It's like, we're the ones in charge around here, and in order for you to go back to Erebor, which they never called Erebor, they always called it the Lonely Mountain. They were never there. It wasn't their job to police the people of Middle-earth. The White Council was there because of Sauron, and that's it. Their job was to look out for him. They didn't care about the dwarves going back to the Lonely Mountain. It wasn't any of their business. It didn't impact on them at all. And so when they put this in there, they're like, we've got to keep the dwarves from going back to the Lonely Mountain. They didn't have to trick Elrond into, keeping one eye on Gandalf while the rest of the party were scampering off into the hills. That's just dumb. Never happened. What happened instead was, like I said, Elrond saw them, gave them food, gave them shelter. Just before the whole incident with the trolls, one of the ponies had gotten spooked, got into a river, and most of their food had been washed away. He replaced all that food. He helped them on their way. He took their map. He translated the moon writing, and so that they could figure out where the door was and how to get through it into the caverns, or into the Lonely Mountain. And then they left with his, blessing, basically. And so why they did this crap about, we can't let the dwarves go back to the Lonely Mountain. And Gandalf's like, I'm going to trick you into... It made no sense. It was a dwarf business. Why would the White Council even care? So anyway, then there's the whole thing. They get into the mountains. The mountain giants, the rock giants throwing boulders and stuff happened. Not a lot of people remember that, but yeah, it happened. They find a cave, and Gandalf is actually with them. He's there the whole time because they left. They didn't leave secretly. Elrond's like, bye guys, have fun. And they go up into the mountains. And then it's raining, so they find the cave. They go in the cave, and Bilbo isn't trying to leave. I mean, yeah, Thorin does kind of tell him that he looked like a grocer bobbing and huffing on the mat, but he wasn't like, you shouldn't be with us. The dwarves had more trust in Gandalf than that. They realized that Gandalf was a wizard and wouldn't have picked Bilbo if they thought that he was completely useless. They had no problem with Bilbo. They weren't trying to belittle him or anything like that, or saying he didn't deserve to be along with them. And so they go in to this cave, and Bilbo has a dream. It turns out to be kind of like a prescient dream where the crack opens up in the floor and everybody falls, the ponies fall in and stuff. Well, what happens is he wakes up. It wasn't in the floor; it was in the back of the cave. Crack opens up. Well, he wakes up, sees that the ponies are being dragged into this crack that's opened up in the back of the cave, and shouts a warning. The goblins jump out. Gandalf kills a bunch of them with his magic, but the rest of them get captured. They get pulled down there, and then when they get down to the bottom, Gandalf shows up again and uses his magic to basically kill the leader of the goblins there in the hole, and start using these sparks that he caused the fire to shoot up to the ceiling and then shoot out sparks everywhere, and the sparks started burning through the goblins and stuff. It's a great scene in the book. And all 15 of them book it. just running out of there. And Dory, if I remember right, was giving Bilbo basically a piggyback ride because the dwarves could run faster through the tunnels than he could. I mean, he's shorter than they are. They go through a tunnel. Dory gets grabbed from behind. Bilbo falls off his back. It rolls down. They couldn't find him. Gandalf and Thorin show up. And they start waving their swords around, which were glowing blue. Both Gandalf's and Thorin's swords were specifically made in Gondolin by elven smiths for the Elf and Goblin Wars. So they could be used just like Sting, just like Bilbo's sword, that they used later to kind of be a goblin detector. It wasn't just Bilbo's sword that was special in that way. Both Glamdring and Orcrist both glowed blue in the presence of orcs and goblins. And so they were killing the orcs and goblins. Bilbo falls off and meets up with Gollum and finds the ring. They get out there, and the company had left way before Bilbo did. And they were outside debating on going back in to find him. They're like, how could you have dropped our thief, Dory? And he's like, well, you try it when Goblin grabs you from behind and then Thorin and Gandalf are swinging swords around. You try keeping track of the Hobbit. And that's when Bilbo shows up. And they realize they're on the other side of the Misty Mountains and everything. They start trying to get as far away from the goblins as possible. The goblins come out at night and chase after them. Not exactly. Basically what happens, they get chased by wargs first, climb up in the trees, then the goblins come. And there isn't this whole thing about like Bilbo saving Thorin from the White Orc. The White Orc was dead. He was dead way before any of this happened. I don't know why they brought him in. It made no sense. The goblins were already ticked off that Thorin and company had escaped from them and killed the Great Goblin. There was no reason to bring in this outside White Goblin, or White Orc. There was no reason for him. None. So anyway, they get to the trees, they climb up in the trees, the wargs won't let them leave, the orcs the goblins show up, and the thing is that the wargs and the goblins were getting together to go raid a human village, basically. And they thought that these guys were spies, and so they were not letting them leave. And then they're like, well, if we can't get them down, we'll just burn the trees down. So they start a fire to get them out of the trees. Well, the eagles come and save them, obviously. And you find out about the whole relationship between the eagles and Gandalf. Gandalf had actually found the king of the eagles. He'd been wounded, and he patched him up and got him back healthy again so that the eagles were eternally grateful to Gandalf. And basically picked up the dwarves, saved them from the goblins, and then later set them down just outside of Mirkwood Forest. And that's where they run into Bjorn. And Bjorn, again, I don't know why they did this. Apparently Bjorn's hovel, if you will, was crap. It was basically a hobo shack. But in the book, it was a grand hall. He had trained animals that would bring, would dress the table and bring food and all this stuff. And it was a really nice place. It was light and airy. He had massive beehives that he kept. He had, I'm trying to remember. He was a great big guy, great big but happy guy. He was kind of testy. Gandalf did the same thing with Bjorn that happened with the Hobbit at the beginning. He's like, if 15 of us show up at Bjorn's house, he's going to toss us out on our ears. He doesn't like having all those people around, and he doesn't really like dwarves. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go 2 by 2. So Gandalf and Bilbo go. And we go 2 by 2 until Bomber, who's basically big enough for 2, he'll go by himself. He doesn't. he comes with the other three at the end. But the thing is Gandalf's explaining the story to Bjorn of how they got from Hobbiton to his door, and every time he talks about the company, he adds another descriptor that says that's a little bit bigger than it actually is. And he's like, and so Bjorn gets enmeshed in the story. That's not really the word I want to use here. But he gets wrapped up in the story, and he wants to hear the end of it. And so when Gandalf keeps interrupting to call more people in, it just whets Bjorn's appetite for more of the story. And so by the time they're done with the story, there's 15 people sitting in Bjorn's really nice house. Really nice house. He doesn't have these slave bracelets on. He's not this grumpy, irascible, angry guy. He's a happy, he laughs. He has, I mean, who would want 15 people to show up on their doorstep and expect them to feed them and provision them, you know? No one. Mother Teresa maybe, but she's in a different class of people altogether. But they find out about the whole skin changer thing, and Bjorn fits them up. He's like, here's food, here's all of the supplies you'll need, here's some ponies, you can take them as far as the entrance to Mirkwood, then you have to leave them. I will not let my ponies go into Mirkwood. And he's nice to them. He's not grumpy and no. It was a complete mischaracterization. So, anyway, Gandalf leaves them at that point. He gets them to the entrance to Mirkwood Forest and is like, I'm out of here, guys. I have other stuff that I need to be doing, and I put it off as long as I could, got you this far, but now you'll have to rely on Mr. Baggins because he's my representative and there's more about him than you guys realize. And then he takes off. And the dwarves get into Mirkwood Forest and start going through the forest. They do not lose the path. They run out of food, is what happens. They get in there and they run out of food, and then one night they're sitting there and they see a light off in the distance, and it's a party. They can see it's a party, and so that's what gets them off the path, and they interrupt the wood elves at their party. They do this 3 times. The third time, you find out Thorin got captured. He got a spell placed upon him that caused him to fall asleep, and then he got captured. The others, they just basically got all separated, and then they got captured by the giant spiders. And when Bilbo wakes up, there's a spider trying to tie him up in silk. Thought he would stay asleep while he was wrapping him up, so it didn't inject him with venom. So spider gets killed. Bilbo names his sword Sting and goes off to rescue the others. Rescues everybody, drives the spiders absolutely bonkers, and they get back to the clearing where the wood elves were having their party, and that's when Bilbo walks in and finds that the dwarves who've been poisoned, they're starving to death. They're basically at their last bit of strength, and they can't go on any further. They get captured by the wood elves. And you know what? Peter Jackson put Legolas in there, which he wasn't mentioned by name, but he was a prince of the wood elves. He would have been, and he would have been there. He wasn't a young man. He was an elf. Basically, the Tolkien elves live forever. So he could have been hundreds and hundreds of years old. So it wasn't like he was born following the Hobbit and he could not have been there. He totally could have been there. He was the son of Thranduil. So he totally would have been there. Now, whether or not he would have been with a party of the wood elves out on guard duty or something, sweeping the forest, who knows? I can see that. I can see that happening. I can see Legolas being there and questioning the dwarves and saying, well, we're going to take you to my father and all this stuff. It wasn't specifically mentioned. And Peter Jackson, he put him in there for better or worse. He should have limited his involvement putting him in there. I mean, yes, put him in there, do the whole Gimli joke, whatever. But he shouldn't have gone as far as he did with it, because Legolas had a huge role in the movie, a role he never should have had. Okay. Anyway, so they get captured. Bilbo saves everyone, finds out that Thorin's there, saves everyone, gets them all into the barrels. It was his idea to put them in the barrels. He'd been wandering around the palace for excuse me, for a while. He's wandering around the palace trying to figure out how to get everybody out. He even went followed elves out to wander around outside for a while, and then he came back. Anyway, he gets them, and they leave. And there was no chase through the river. No, they just left. Quite a bit less dramatic than that stupid chase scene where Fili, I believe it was Fili, who has an elven love interest. Are you serious? Now, this isn't Warhammer, where the dwarves have a grudge against the elves and they absolutely hate each other. The dwarves and the elves in the Tolkien universe just don't like each other. And it has nothing to do with, like, Thranduil turning his back on the dwarves like a complete and utter jerk. No. It's just that the dwarves see the elves as flighty and basically they're not serious enough for the dwarves. And the elves tease the dwarves because the dwarves are too serious. They just don't get along. It has nothing to do with, we were attacked by dragons and you just turned your back on us and left us to suffer. It wasn't any of that crap. Thranduil was an enormously nice guy. He was a great guy. When he, which is another thing that Peter Jackson really irritates me. He's like, Thranduil for some reason was obsessed with getting these jewels back from the Horde of Smaug. He wasn't. He did come to the Lonely Mountain because Smaug was dead, and so they figured that his horde was up for grabs. Yes, who wouldn't? I mean, there's a big treasure lying there waiting. Nobody has claim on it, or nobody has claimed it yet. The Guardian is dead. Well, we could use the money, sure. So he sets out for the treasure, but he finds out what happened to the Lake Men. He finds out what happened to their town. And instead of going to the mountain, he turns his people and goes and helps the humans. If he wouldn't help the dwarves when they were right there, why on earth would he help the humans? And don't give me this nonsense about him just wanting the white jewels. That wasn't there. Bilbo ended up giving those jewels to Thranduil later. Because he's like, here, you take this. And he's like, well, why are you giving me a gift? And he's like, I lived in your hall for a while. I stole your food. I feel that I need to repay you. And he's like, well, I don't understand any of this, but thank you, Master Hobbit. Thranduil was a good guy. He was a great king. And Tauriel, I understand that you're putting a strong female character in the movie. Whatever. Why are you making her fall in love with a dwarf? Never would have happened. The dwarves and the elves just didn't get along. Like I said, there was that main understanding between the two races that were like, we're too different. So anyway, Fili didn't get injured by a Morgul tainted weapon. So none of the dwarves remained at Lake Town. They all took off and went up to the mountain. All of them hale and hearty. It's just Peter Jackson trying to pull in the Lord of the Rings trilogy and tie it to The Hobbit. He doesn't need to. The ring is the only tie that you need. You already set up that Bilbo found the ring, got it from Gollum, and you did it in The Lord of the Rings. You don't need to keep pulling that in. And yeah, so anyway, they get to the mountain, but Bilbo was the only one who would go and face the dragon. The rest of the dwarves, none of that. If I remember right, Dory actually came inside for a little ways and was like, oh, this is as far as I'm going. And Bilbo actually goes in and they talk for more than more than once before he just gets so mad that he smashes the side of the mountain and then goes off to Lake Town. And there actually was the thrush. The thrush was a huge part of the movie, or huge part of the book. Basically, Bard, he's like some freedom fighter smuggler against the master of the town. Yes, the master of the town was corrupt, but he wasn't like he wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't holding the people under his thumb and you must do what I say. I'm the master of the town. He just liked his luxuries. And so Bard wasn't some freedom fighting smuggler. He was the captain of the town guard. And there wasn't this whole thing about this special dragon killing weapon or anything like that. Yes, there was a black arrow. Bard has a line where he grabs the black arrow from his sheath after the thrush comes and tells Bard where to find the spot on Smaug's stomach, basically on his chest, where the scale was missing. He basically tells Bard from Bilbo, who found it out. Bilbo finds out that a scale is missing and explains it to the dwarves. The thrush was sitting there listening. The thrush goes back to Lake Town. Turns out Bard can understand thrushes, but it was something passed down through his line and through the line of the thrushes. Anyway, Bard is basically the only one still working. Everybody else has abandoned ship. The town's on fire, and the thrush passes on the message of the missing scale. Bard gets an arrow from his quiver and says, "Black arrow, if ever you came from the forges of the true king under the mountain, I forget the rest of it." But basically, he fires the arrow from his bow and brings down Smaug, who lands right on top of the town. And then we get to the whole battle of five armies. The elves, they come. They find out that the humans are in such dire straits because their town's been obliterated. A dragon fell on it. Come on. They stop going to the mountain. They go and they help the humans. They help them. And then the whole town goes up. Yes, the Arkenstone was there, but there wasn't this whole thing of we need the Arkenstone to prove Thorin's the king so that the dwarves will band behind him. There wasn't any of that crap. Bilbo does steal the Arkenstone. Yes, he does. And he ends up doing something very noble with it. He gives it to the humans and the elves and stuff. And the reason he does that is because Thorin said he prized the Arkenstone above a mountain of gold. He figured that at this point, Thorin, who didn't want to give the treasure out, and he didn't have to, he felt threatened. First of all, he'd been captured and imprisoned by the elves, so he wasn't feeling too kindly disposed towards them. And then basically he has two armies camped on his doorstep demanding payment. And he's like, no, send the elves away, then we'll talk. Come back here without your swords. He wasn't being unreasonable. He wasn't being crazy. It's like you're sitting there, you're barricaded inside your house. Your house is full of treasures, and your neighbor and some guy you can't stand because he smashed your car and wouldn't pay for it. They're coming over to your house demanding that you be reasonable and give them some of your money. And you're like, no. Send that dude away that I hate. Go home to your home, put away your weapons, and then come back and we'll talk. Thorin wasn't being unreasonable. He didn't have this gold fever. Ugh. And then the Battle of the Five Armies. So the dwarves show up from the Iron Hills. Gandalf is there. The dwarves, elves, and humans were about to go throw down. And Gandalf shows up and he's like, look, there's an army of goblins coming. You guys need to do something right now. And so they all get together and they're like, okay, we have a common enemy. It's not each other. everybody hates the orcs or the goblins. We got to get rid of them first. So they start fighting. Bilbo at that point had been kicked out by Thorin, and he was with Gandalf and the elves, if I remember right. And so they're ready for the dwarves or the orcs and stuff. The orcs come riding in on wargs. They don't have these dune sandworms that burrow through these tunnels, and then if you had a worm that size, why would you let it burrow out and then go away? Just have it roll over on the other armies and you're done. Why the sandworms? They made no sense. Again, no stupid white orc. It was dumb. The white orc story was stupid. Thorin and the 13 dwarves that came with him, they basically break out of the mountain and charge into battle when everything started looking its bleakest. The first time it started looking its bleakest. But Thorin gets killed by the bodyguards of the Great Goblin, the new one, Bolg, if I remember right at that point. And Fili and Kili at that point, they get killed defending Thorin's body. But Bjorn shows up and he kills the Great Goblin and scatters his bodyguard, takes Thorin out of combat, and the eagles show up, and basically the battle is won. The orcs go scurrying off back to the mountains. Thorin and Bilbo apologize to each other, and Thorin's like, "I was stupid, and I should have." And you're correct. Your approach was correct. We should have tried to make friends rather than enemies and stuff. Bilbo goes back, gives the jewels and stuff to the king of the elves, and picks up the gold from the trolls. If I remember right, he gives like some of it away because he's like, it's not really mine, it should be, but I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've read it. Anyway, he gets back home. They have the whole thing of him being dead, and there's the auction and all that stuff, and he has to get all his stuff back. But one of the things that they mention at the end of The Hobbit is they bury Thorin. They entomb him under the mountain, and they put Orcrist on top of his tomb. And it says that the sword glowed in the presence of enemies. And so the mountain could never be taken by surprise. Kind of a huge thing. And then we get into the rest of the Lord of the Rings. We get into that. And I think it was a mistake. I think somebody didn't say, oh, Gandalf's sword glows too, and so they couldn't retcon it at this point, that Gandalf's sword also glowed, because they didn't make it glow in The Lord of the Rings. Anyway, so what I suggest is you go watch Rankin Bass. Go watch the cartoon. I've heard that like some of Tolkien's family and stuff didn't really like it, but just divorce in your mind the fact that Peter Jackson made The Hobbit. He made an action movie, a pretty good action movie, terrible Hobbit movie. And then you go read the book. The book is so much better. There's none of this crappy side plots that make no sense. There's none of these additions that make no sense. And you just read the book for the book itself, because it's a great book. So that's it. I'm signing off, and still working on the island of the day before, and that should be for the next episode.